The number of states targeted in cyberattacks on water systems has jumped to 12. Fast Company, Axios, The Guardian, and NBC News describe a widening public utility security problem that now reaches more communities than earlier notices suggested. Local operators and federal investigators are sorting out which intrusions affected service, which were attempted access, and which require public warnings. The important point for the public is practical. Drinking water agencies may need faster reporting, clearer emergency contacts, and more visible cyber defenses. The reports also show why small municipal systems can become national security concerns when attackers probe equipment that serves neighborhoods every day. Residents should look for dated notices from local utilities, state emergency offices, or federal cyber officials rather than social media rumors. The next concrete signal is whether investigators identify a common method, issue mitigation guidance, or name additional affected systems. Until then, the verified takeaway is that the threat map has broadened and public agencies are under pressure to show what protections are in place. The practical test now is accountability. Whether water operators explain service impact, name protective steps, and give residents plain instructions before another alert cycle begins across the affected states, especially where smaller utilities lack large security staffs and rely on state support for monitoring and public communication. Abdul El-Sayed, Haley Stevens square off Tuesday in Michigan Democratic primary. Jewish Telegraphic Agency, CNBC, The New York Times, and The Guardian frame the contest as a high-profile Senate fight with national Democratic attention. Polling coverage says the margin has tightened, while campaign coverage points to sharp contrasts on Israel, party strategy, and electability. For people outside Michigan, the race matters because it tests what kind of nominee Democratic voters want in a competitive cycle. The result could shape fundraising, endorsements, and the national message heading into the general election. It also gives activists a visible measure of whether ideological arguments or swing state pragmatism carry more weight with voters. The cleanest next signal is the official vote count, followed by concession or victory statements from the campaigns. Watch also for whether party committees move quickly to unify donors and activists after the result. Until ballots are reported, the grounded read is that a once-clear contest has narrowed enough to make turnout and late persuasion central. The practical test now is coalition behavior, whether the winner receives quick endorsements, whether disappointed groups stay engaged, and whether national committees treat the seat as immediately competitive in fundraising, staffing, advertising, and voter registration planning before Republicans define the race first during the next news cycle and fall organizing push. Man arrested near Trump golf course after gun found in car. Axios, NPR, CBS News, and Al Jazeera report that authorities detained a person near the Southern California property ahead of a planned presidential visit. The accounts focus on ammunition, apparent surveillance of security, and law enforcement concern before the trip. The public question is whether officials treat the case as an isolated arrest, a security breach, or a warning sign for future travel planning. That distinction matters because it affects perimeter rules, local policing costs, and public access around major political events. Viewers should separate confirmed charges from speculation about motive until prosecutors file detailed allegations. The timing also puts renewed attention on how local departments coordinate with federal protective teams before campaign-style movements. The next reliable checkpoint is a police update, court filing, or agency statement explaining the evidence and any threat assessment. For now, the verified story is a security-related arrest near a sensitive venue, with investigators still controlling the factual record. The practical test now is transparency. Whether authorities disclose a timeline, describe how the weapon was discovered, and explain any changes to protective planning for future visits, including coordination between municipal officers, federal teams, venue managers, and prosecutors handling the public record in court, and official press briefings now ahead clearly. Trump administration refunds 100 BN in Liberation Day tariffs. Financial Times, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and France 24 describe a tariff fight that now carries a large fiscal price tag and multiple legal challenges. The dispute matters because importers, consumers, and trading partners all need to know whether duties already collected will stand. State lawsuits add another layer by questioning the authority behind the policy and the process used to impose it. If refunds proceed broadly, federal accounts, customs procedures, and business planning could all change at the same time. If courts narrow the relief, companies may face a patchwork of repayments and continuing trade costs. The issue also feeds into wider trade talks because allies will measure whether Washington can keep penalties in force. The next reliable signal is a court order, customs bulletin, or formal negotiating text from affected governments. Until those records appear, the grounded takeaway is that the policy has moved from campaign-style trade pressure into a costly legal and administrative test. The practical test now is implementation. whether refunds are automatic or contested, whether importers must file claims, and whether trading partners alter retaliation plans after the legal signal. While companies decide how much uncertainty to pass into prices, contracts, supply decisions, earnings guidance, and inventory planning this quarter ahead now. Fed's Paulson keeps open mind on rate policy outlook amid high inflation. Reuters, Bloomberg, CNBC, and the Economic Times report that the Philadelphia regional central bank leader is not locking herself into a fixed vote path. The comments matter because investors are trying to judge whether stubborn price growth will keep borrowing costs elevated. A cautious stance can influence bond yields, mortgage expectations, and the way businesses plan hiring or investment. The key nuance is that openness is not the same as a promise to cut or hold. Policymakers still need inflation data, labor numbers, and financial conditions before the next decision. Markets will also listen for whether other officials describe price pressure as temporary, sticky, or broadening across services, wages, and household inflation expectations in future surveys. Viewers should watch the next consumer price release and any updated remarks from voting officials. If the data cools, the debate may shift toward timing. If it stays hot, patience becomes the safer institutional message. The practical test now is communication. Whether rate setters use the same cautious language, whether markets price another hold, and whether inflation reports give officials room to shift without appearing to ignore households still facing high costs for rent, food, services, debt, insurance, credit, childcare, transportation, utilities, medicine, repairs, taxes, fuel, tuition, fees, and groceries. Polymarket in talks for fundraising round at more than $20 billion valuation. CNBC, Bloomberg, the Crypto Times, and Quartz report that the prediction market company is seeking a very large private funding mark. The reported valuation matters because it shows how much investors may pay for platforms tied to elections, sports, crypto, and real-time probability pricing. CNBC has also reported that the company described annualized revenue above $1 billion earlier this year. A round at this level would raise questions about regulation, market integrity, and whether user growth can support the price. It would also signal that private investors see forecasting markets as consumer products, not only niche trading venues. Private talks can change, so viewers should not treat the figure as a closed deal. The next reliable signal is a company statement, investor disclosure, or regulatory filing that confirms terms. Until then, the verified takeaway is that prediction markets are attracting serious capital while policy scrutiny remains part of the business risk. The practical test now is diligence, whether backers accept the regulatory exposure, whether the company confirms revenue quality, and whether prediction markets keep mainstream user growth after election cycle attention fades and compliance costs rise across U.S. and overseas markets for regulated products, political contracts, payments, identity checks, audits, custody, reporting, and oversight. Live updates, latest from Israel, Iran, and Middle East. The New York Times, France 24, AP News, and The Guardian describe a volatile regional picture involving strikes, diplomacy, oil market pressure, and political calculation. Reports on the Strait of Hormuz matter because shipping risk can quickly affect energy prices and global inflation expectations. Coverage of renewed fighting also raises questions about congressional authority, coalition decisions, and the limits of back-channel diplomacy. For the public, the story is less one single event than a fast-moving chain of official statements and military claims. That makes source discipline especially important. Wait for named governments, militaries, or international bodies to put details on the record. Any shift in oil routes, air defenses, or public warnings could change the risk calculation quickly. The next reliable signal is a public diplomatic statement, maritime advisory, or confirmed military update. Until then, the grounded takeaway is that escalation risk remains high while markets and governments watch for proof of de-escalation. The practical test now is verification, whether energy, military, and diplomatic signals point in the same direction, or whether contradictory claims keep traders and governments defensive as naval routes, insurance costs, and alliance messaging shift under pressure from each capital, command center, shipping lane, oil desk, refinery, port, tanker, pipeline, insurer, broker, and agency. Netanyahu says no Israeli withdrawal from Gaza until Hamas has been completely disarmed. AP News, The Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and the Jerusalem Post report a hard condition attached to any pullback. The statement matters because it links military positioning to the separate question of weapons, governance, and outside guarantees. If the condition holds, negotiators may have less room to sequence a ceasefire, hostage arrangements, or reconstruction steps. If mediators find a formula for verification, the same language could become a framework for phased movement. The humanitarian stakes remain high because border access, security control, and aid planning often depend on the same negotiations. Viewers should watch for whether Hamas, Israel, the United States, or regional mediators confirm the same terms in writing. The next concrete checkpoint is a published proposal, cabinet decision, or on-record mediator briefing. Until that appears, the verified takeaway is that withdrawal remains tied to disarmament demands, and the gap between battlefield control and diplomatic sequencing is still unresolved. The practical test now is sequencing. Whether disarmament verification, troop positions, hostage issues, and aid access can be written into one timetable that each side publicly accepts, with monitors credible enough to survive inevitable disputes over timing, control, enforcement, aid delivery, violations, reconstruction access, border rules, guarantees, policing, governance, security, and oversight. Ukrainian drone strike on Russian warehouses in Moscow region kills 5, local official says. Reuters, CBS News, France 24, and News Corps report overnight attacks that local authorities link to storage sites and casualties. The episode matters because deep strikes can pressure Russian logistics while also increasing the risk of retaliation against Ukrainian cities. Warehouse fires and casualty claims are often difficult to verify immediately, so official statements and imagery need careful separation from wartime messaging. For the public, the operational question is whether the attacks disrupt supply chains, air defenses, or only isolated facilities. The political question is how Moscow frames the incident at home and whether Kyiv signals a broader campaign. Insurance costs, transport delays, and emergency repairs can also become part of the military effect if strikes continue. The next reliable checkpoint is a military update, regional emergency report, or independent confirmation of damage. Until then, the grounded takeaway is that cross-border drone warfare is still expanding beyond the front line and into infrastructure targets. The practical test now is confirmation. Whether satellite images, local emergency reports, or military statements show lasting damage, and whether either side changes its strike tempo as logistics, civilian risk, and propaganda pressure interact across the wider war, regional defenses, repair crews, air alerts, fuel routes, and depots.